Well, thank you very much thank you for the invitation. When I was a student a few years ago, I used to come occasionally to sort of slightly sweaty gigs in this place. I never thought that I would actually be on the stage in the Roundhouse, so that's something I've ticked off. I also want to welcome the sense of diversity that you represent here, even extending to middle-aged guys wearing a tie. So that is very welcome too. I'm glad to be here. I was glad to accept this invitation because I very, very strongly support what you are doing. And I want to say a few words about why. So I was asked to do a job to bring together different strands of activity across Europe to try and tackle some of the security threats that we face now. They're not unique to Europe. They're reflected in many other parts of the world, and particularly many other parts of the democratic world at the same time. We face challenges from terrorism, from extremist violence, from hybrid, from hostile cyber, whether that is economic or political. Obviously, that's why we're here, from cyber-enabled disinformation. We also face some really challenging problems of the future. How are we going to secure our critical digital infrastructure for the future? How are we going to secure a positive vision of technology for the future? And it's these challenges that have changed the nature of the way security work is done. Security work, as you all know, has traditionally been something that national authorities take responsibility for, hold very close. And that's only natural. National governments are responsible in the front line for the security and safety of their citizens. But against these kind of challenges, you not only can, you have to work together. And there's been a growing recognition of that internationally, but particularly in Europe. And I'm very glad about that. It's enabled us to do some new things over the last few years against some of these challenges, in particular around how we organize ourselves to deal with terrorism, cyber, and cyber-enabled challenges. We've done a lot of work over the last few months in the run-up to the European Parliamentary elections. We were concerned that the European Parliamentary elections presented a very tempting target to somebody who wanted to seek to interfere in our democratic processes and our democratic lives. After all, they took place in the end across 28 countries. We're talking about hundreds of millions of electors. It is easy to imagine how you might seek to interfere with that process. In the end, I'm glad to say, as a democratic exercise, those elections went off well. Participation rates went from just above 40% to above 50% across Europe. I mean, you can do better, but that's not bad, and it's going in the right direction. We didn't see any kind of spectacular attack. We didn't see a big hack of the sort that, of course, we have seen in the past in the States, and indeed there are examples in Europe too. We didn't see a very high-profile attack against a campaign, as, of course, they saw a few years ago in France when the Macron campaign was attacked. I'd like to think that some of the things that we did, some of the countermeasures that we put in place, had some effect, but I'm not naive. I also recognize that what we're dealing with are, as you know very well, changing tactics, changing ways of seeking to do disinformation, where the big stuff that was very attractive a few years ago but attracts a lot of attention, negative attention, maybe is not quite so popular, but smaller activity, the spreading of divisive and poisonous disinformation designed to disrupt and fan division in our democratic processes and in our societies is, I'm afraid, all too prevalent. The European parliamentary elections were not a disinformation-free zone. Quite the contrary. We saw a lot of disinformation activity all across Europe. Poland, Latvia, France, the UK, Spain, just to name a few, saw incidents which, thanks to people like you, we were able to map and react to. Some of the countermeasures that we put in place were about getting governments and authorities to work together better. So we got all the member states together to work on election security. People who run elections, but people who think about cybersecurity, people who think about data security. In some countries, these people didn't talk to each other. We got them together all across Europe. We set up a rapid alert system. So experts, including from civil society, but also from the administrations, to look out for examples of organized disinformation and share that information, learn from each other, think about how to react. We work with the politicians. We work with the European Parliament, we work with the parties, we work with the individual candidates. That helped them, but it also meant they talked about this. They communicated about this problem, which raised, I think crucially, raised some critical awareness. Somebody told me last night that this was now a kitchen sink issue. I'm not quite sure. I don't know how many households talk about this issue every day, but the fact that there is more debate is obviously crucially valuable. But one of the things that we did, which I hope is an example, which is to be followed elsewhere, was we sat down with the big social media platforms, and together we agreed a new code of practice on tackling disinformation. We didn't come up with this. We worked with the platforms to develop it. We agreed with the platforms that we had to take some measures to increase transparency. So this isn't about judging whether a particular piece of political content is in itself true or false, good or bad. That would be to go down the road of censorship. But it is about insisting that there is more transparency. A light is shone on the provenance of political material so that we, all as citizens, have a better chance to understand what it is we're being shown and to appraise it critically. So together with the big platforms, and I want to salute them for their engagement on this, Facebook, Twitter, Google, others, we have developed a series of measures around greater transparency for political ads, tackling bots and fake news, fake accounts who are spreading fake news, and in particular, increased access to independent scrutiny, engagement with you and others like you who want to make a contribution. We made some progress, but there's still further to go. We got the ad libraries up. Some of the things that have been done in the States, we got them done in Europe. I'd have liked to have done it a bit sooner, but we got it done. But we still need to make those ad libraries work better. We had problems with false positives and false negatives in Germany, as some of you may have read. Ads for Dungeons and Dragons virtual reality games got caught in the ad libraries. Ads for AfD didn't. That's obviously the wrong way around. We had problems with delays. Legitimate political actors, parties and others face delays of 72 hours sometimes to get their ads registered. If we're going to use these libraries and we're going to encourage people to use them, they need to work better. We made some progress in terms of shining a light on bots and fake accounts. Obviously, different platforms have different versions of that problem. Some of the platforms have done a lot to try and bear down on that problem. But we still saw in every one of those cases that I mentioned in different countries, groups, accounts that were peddling clear disinformation.
And we need to do more to try and stop bots and fake accounts playing that role in our democratic processes. We made some progress in opening up platforms to independent scrutiny, groups like yours. But there's still much further to go. We also get a lot of feedback from you that it is too difficult sometimes to engage with the platforms and do an independent audit of what's going on in order better to understand what's happened in the past, learn the lessons, and prepare ourselves to deal with this problem in future. Because this problem isn't going away. We've got through the European Parliamentary elections. But just in Europe, there are elections every week of the year, if you take some important regional elections into account. And of course, around the democratic world, there are always elections somewhere. So one of our challenges, I think, and we need your help in this, is to avoid a sort of feeling of relief. Phew, we got through the European Parliamentary elections. It wasn't as bad as we feared it might have been. Maybe we can take a pause. I don't think we can take a pause. I think we need to find ways of making sure that we continue to do this work, because the people who are trying to do us harm, the people who are trying to use cyber and cyber-enabled means to attack our shared values, our way of life, unfortunately, they are not going to be taking a pause. I just wanted to mention briefly one other thing, and that is the challenge I mentioned at the start of securing our critical digital infrastructure and our critical tech for the future. Because it's fine and crucially important to be doing the work that we're doing about stuff that is going across our social media networks and across the way we live our digital lives, but we have to secure the plumbing of those digital lives as well. Right now, there's a lot of debate and discussion, as you know very well, around 5G, but it's not just about 5G. It's about other critical digital tech that will be coming in from AI and different forms of computing. On many of the disinformation challenges, we are clearly in this together. All of the countries in Europe, the states around the rest of the world who share those democratic values are in this together and crucially work together. When it comes to tackling the challenge of securing our critical digital infrastructure, I just want to say we need to be very careful that we don't find that we're doing that in a way that gets in the way of that cooperation. We need to find ways of tackling that challenge in an aligned and positive way too. So, when it comes to 5G, the subject that's on the agenda right now, the US has set out a very clear position. Europe is also grappling with this problem. Europe entirely agrees that we have to put security at the heart of thinking about 5G. When it was 2, 3, even 4G, it was a lot about cost and price. This time, because of the role it's going to play, it has to be about security. But Europe starts from a slightly different place from the US on this. There is more Chinese tech on the ground in Europe than there is in the US. In Europe, we don't naturally mix national security and trade issues. We don't reach for blanket bans. We have an open market and committed to fair trade. If you observe the rules, you can have access to that market. So we start from a slightly different place. But we've also said, and this is absolutely crucial, that we are going to think through in Europe the risks, the obvious risks that are associated with this technology, and also think through thoroughly all the measures that could be taken to mitigate and manage those risks. And maybe at the end of that process, a little bit later this year, we conclude together that some of those risks can't be managed, can't be mitigated, and that therefore we will conclude that some products, services, some suppliers are unsafe. And we'll do that in full transparency and openness, and we will justify it publicly. So I don't want to predict, still less prejudice where that process is going to come out, but I think it's absolutely key that we do it in a way that is aligned so that all the democracies that are fighting this crucial fight against disinformation stay in lockstep against all of these different threats. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Julian. For the interactive portion of this, we're going to take it to the audience for Q&A. And so if you have not downloaded the app yet, download it now. That's where you can submit questions so that you don't forget them at the beginning of the presentation. Questions will go up onto the big board, but we will also take a few from the audience. Specifically, I'll start with one. With disinformation in European Parliament elections, clearly disinformation is not a challenge that recognizes our neatly defined borders and things like that. And with 28, perhaps 27 member states, do you see disinformation from foreign actors or from domestic actors as a larger challenge?
So as you know very well, some of these distinctions between foreign and domestic have been and are getting blurred. So we have made no bones about the fact that in Europe, some of the interference, attempted interference, comes from outside. In particular, quite a lot of it over recent years has come from pro-Kremlin sources. We have a team, which I think you're familiar with, in Brussels that maps this, and they have mapped over the last couple of years over 5,000 examples, documented examples of coordinated pro-Kremlin disinformation campaigns. That continued in the run-up to the European Parliamentary elections. The numbers weren't huge, but there were documented cases, around 1,000 in the first months of this year, from pro-Kremlin sources. That is about double the rate for the equivalent period the year before. But it isn't, let's be honest, it isn't just from the outside, and it isn't just from pro-Kremlin sources. A lot of other actors have learnt this playbook. And as you know very well, because you are on the front line, this kind of disinformation activity is now, unfortunately, quite widely spread, with quite a lot of different actors, both external and domestic, using this as a means of accelerating their often divisive messages. So the measures that we're taking are measures to build our resilience, to make us more secure against this kind of challenge, wherever it comes from.
Thank you. And questions from the audience? Gentleman right here.
Hi. I'm Simon Papuashvili. I work for International Partnership for Human Rights, which is a Brussels-based NGO, works with the EU advocacy, among others. My question relates to the resources that European Union allocates to counter disinformation. And resources are important, and if we acknowledge that a country in the east of EU is putting significantly more resources into disinformation work, and so far the resources from the European Commission has been a tiny fraction compared to that from the East. Is there any plan to scale up funding on this issue in any foreseeable future?
So you're absolutely right. I would say, wouldn't I, that resources are not just about the financial input. It's about the effect and the measures that we've been taking, which perhaps we should have been starting sooner, but we have now been taking over the last year or so to try and get the member states to take this seriously and stay engaged, to try and make sure that we're engaging properly with civil society and to engage with the platforms, is, in my view, the way to have effect. There is also some funding that goes into teams like the Stratcom team that I just mentioned that are monitoring particular sorts of activity. There is some funding that will need to go into support for some of the networks that we've set up. And there is some funding, I think there should be more, that needs to go into support for civil society, for networks that are working on this, groups that are working on media diversity. So I agree with the challenge. I think we need to do more, including on funding. I argue that internally. But I don't think we should say that there's some sort of equivalence, that because we think that pro-Kremlin sources, let's be polite, are spending X, then somehow we're only going to be able to deal with this if we match that funding, because I think it works differently.
My name is Tahir. I am from Pakistan, and it's very interesting to understand what you were saying. And in Pakistan, we have a term for it. The establishment basically calls it a fifth-generation war. So, according to them, media and everybody is waging a fifth-generation war using social media. So they have armies of trolls and basically Facebook pages and Twitter accounts and stuff. But the problem is we have certain things that take it further. So we have blasphemy laws. So it's very easy to accuse somebody of blasphemy and getting rid of that person. Then it is very easy for a person to be declared as a traitor and that. So I think that from resources point of view, a sort of hotline where we can access Facebook and Twitter. For example, it's a daily occurrence in Pakistan that top journalists who are anti-establishment, who are talking for pro-democracy forces, they have filthy troll-based trends that are then pushed to the dark web through WhatsApp. And with digital literacy not at that level, people believe that. And that just a few days ago, a far-right blogger was killed in Islamabad at his doorstep. So my point is that social media platforms don't understand Urdu, for example, the language that is used by the masses over there. Secondly, there is no mechanism. So if somebody is threatening me, I raise an alarm, there is no remedy to that. I work for a very big organization. But if I am vulnerable, I feel that a person working on the ground is more vulnerable than. And that is where I think we need to put more resources on.
Sometimes when I get up on the platform and talk about these things, I am occasionally charged with demonizing the platforms. I'm absolutely not in that business. We have got a good partnership with the big platforms. On the other hand, I think that needs to go further. There are lots of different things that the big platforms still need to do, that we want to do with them. And indeed, with the other platforms as well, because we definitely have a problem of displacement with some of this activity. If big platforms take it very seriously, it can spread to other platforms. For me, that's not wholly negative, because it is showing that we're squeezing the space in which bad actors can work. They want to go to the big platforms. They want to have the big reach. If we make it harder for them to do that, that is a relative step forward. But we mustn't ignore the wider ecosystem. We have to deal with that as well. So I am going to continue to press the platforms to do more and to do better. And that is essentially around transparency. It is around this question you refer to bot activity, but in some platforms it's fake accounts. And it is crucially around greater transparency and openness, both in terms of sharing their information and being able to respond when somebody says there is a particular problem. I think there's been a positive evolution in that dialogue that we have with the platforms over the last 12 months, but there's a huge amount more to do. And that's in the States and in Europe, without going to the particular circumstances which you were talking about.
There's a question over here.
Hello. Leon Cook from Eurex Strategy. I enjoyed your presentation, Sir Julian, but what I took from it is that you were mainly talking about political interference and electioneering, and this call to action for all of us assembled here in this room in that context. What I would ask, however, is whether your department within the Commission is in lockstep with the External Action Service to actually introduce punitive measures for state-level actors. There are lots of countries in the world that speak out both sides of their mouth in terms of their adherence to the rule of law, and yet have troll farms all over the place basically peddling disinformation. To what extent does the Commission and the Union have the mechanism to tackle this?
So you're right to challenge us on whether we've got far enough in stitching together the different ways in which you try and deal with this. As I said, I think we could have started earlier on some of these things. I do think that we are now making progress. In one area, which relates to what you've just asked, over the last 6 months or so, we've got agreement amongst all the member states to take cyber activity, hostile cyber activity, seriously. And they have agreed, in fact, only a few weeks ago, they finalized that agreement, that they would take sanction action in response to hostile cyber attacks or interference. And they've agreed a way of doing that and a scale of different sorts of potential response. I think that's important. It goes to the question you're asking. Is it enough? Well, probably it isn't enough. Because although we've now had a much fuller discussion about the kind of threshold and the kind of response that you might envisage, we still have a debate which is unresolved around attribution. And that is difficult. I don't duck it. We need to pursue that so that these measures that have been agreed can be used and don't just sit on the shelf, which would be the worst outcome.
And the last question we'll take from the board, it paraphrased, what keeps you up at night in your current role? But I'll add to that, if you don't want to go down the negative, what makes you optimistic about this work going forward? Because a lot of times we focus on, okay, everything is terrible and disinformation is a big scary thing, but what makes you optimistic about this challenge and how we are addressing it going forward?
Well, the thing that makes me optimistic is that there are more and more people who are engaged on this. Not just you, I think that is fantastic, but there are more and more people in administrations and in ministries who are taking this much more seriously than they did 12 months ago. And I think that is crucial. The other thing that makes me optimistic is, we've already touched upon it, the change in the nature and the quality of the dialogue and debate that we're having between platforms and, on one hand, administrations, authorities, and on the other hand, users, i.e. us, citizens. That has changed out of all recognition over the last 12 months or so. So although this problem is still there, in some respects it is growing, it is certainly becoming more complicated, I think that there are causes for optimism. I went for medical the other day, and they did one of those exercise bike things where they plug you in, and you start on the exercise bike, and it's all quite nice and easy, and they say that's okay, and as it goes along, it gets harder and harder and harder. I think we're in that stage of this fight. We have done some easy stuff. That's great. As we pedal away, it's going to get harder. It's going to get steeper.